In this chapter, we'll look at spline modeling. Spline is just a fancy word for line or curved line, and there are 4 types of splines in 3ds Max. To create splines, we can use the Create panel. Select the category labeled Shapes. In 3ds Max terminology, a shape is a curve object. The first category of splines or shapes is shape primitives, such as a circle or a rectangle. And these are parametric objects with attributes such as radius or length and width. And they're similar to 3D primitives in that respect. So for example, I can create a circle primitive by activating the circle tool and clicking and dragging. And I've just created that circle in the front viewport. The circle tool is still active, so I can click and drag in the perspective view and create another circle. And right-click to exit creation mode. Orbit around with Alt and middle mouse button. And we can see that depending upon which viewport we create something in, we'll get a different orientation to that shape. Likewise with a rectangle primitive, I can click on that tool, click and drag in the front viewport to draw out a rectangle, or click and drag in the top view to create a rectangle there. All right, I'll right-click to exit out of creation mode and select all those objects and delete them. The next category is editable splines, which are Bezier curves. You might be familiar with those from a program like Illustrator. Editable splines have control points and tangent handles that we can move around, hence the name editable. The editable spline object type is also simply known as a line. And all types of spline objects can be converted to editable spline. To create an editable spline from scratch, we can use the line tool. And depending upon how we click, we'll get different types of vertices or control points. If we just single click, we'll create so-called corner points. I'll right-click to complete that line, and right-click again to exit the tool. With that object still selected, I'll delete it with the delete key. Go back to that line tool to illustrate that we can make curved lines at creation time. Click on the line tool. Click once to create a corner point. Click and hold the mouse and drag to create a Bezier curve point. And release the mouse to determine the shape of that curve and go down to create the next point. Click and hold and drag to determine the shape of the curvature. Release the mouse and then go over to another point. And maybe if that's the end here, we can just click once and that's a corner point. And when I'm finished with that line, I can right-click and also right-click again to exit out of the line tool. Okay, I'll delete that as well. Press the delete key. A variation on the editable spline is a freehand spline, which, as the name indicates, can be drawn quickly with mouse strokes. I can choose freehand and just click and drag to draw a line. And keep drawing lines if I want. And I can right-click to exit that tool. If you want to learn all about freehand splines, check out my weekly series, 3ds Max Tips, Tricks, and Techniques. And I cover freehand splines pretty extensively in that weekly series. And I'll select all those once again and press delete. Finally, 3ds Max has NURBS, or non-uniform rational basis splines, and they'll be found in a category from the pull-down list, NURBS curves. NURBS is kind of an antique workflow. We're not going to be covering it in this version of 3ds Max Essential Training. Although NURBS is still a very powerful workflow, especially in mechanical engineering and product design, in 3ds Max you're probably going to want to stay with the ordinary Bezier splines or curves because they are actually much easier to work with. They also generally give better results than NURBS, and they're still under active development. If you need to learn about NURBS in 3ds Max, you can go back to an earlier version of this course, 3ds Max 2016 Essential Training. That's an introduction to spline curves or shapes.